When Britain declared war in September 1939, its factories were already humming with the familiar clatter of Enfield machinery. The army expected to fight with the Lee Enfield No. 4, a modernization of the rifle that had carried the Empire through the Great War. Yet deep in government depots, stacked in wooden crates since 1918, rested another weapon, the pattern 1914. It had been designed a generation earlier to replace the very rifle that now stood on the front line. Fate had sidelined it once. History would summon it again. The pattern 1914 was a child of both ambition and circumstance. In 1912, British ordnance officers sought a successor to the short magazine Lee Enfield, believing that a stronger, more accurate design was needed to match the Mauser rifles seen in the Boer War. The experimental pattern 13 fired a high-velocity .276 round, but war interrupted its trials. When the First World War erupted, the new design was hastily adapted back to the standard .303 British cartridge and built in American factories. By 1916, rifles marked Winchester, Remington, and Eddystone were arriving by the hundreds of thousands. They were heavier and slower to cycle than the SMLE, but extraordinarily accurate, a rifleman's instrument rather than an infantryman's companion. After 1918, the pattern 1914 slipped quietly into storage. Britain, disarmed by relief and recession, had no need for its surplus precision rifle. But when Europe caught fire again, the Empire rediscovered the value of everything it had once cast aside. The evacuation from Dunkirk left Britain with a fraction of its small arms stockpile. Weapons were lost on beaches and roads from Calais to Cherbourg. In that desperate summer of 1940, clerks opened the old War Department ledgers and found tens of thousands of pattern 1914s still catalogued in ordnance depots from Weedon to Enfield Lock. Crates were pried open, rifles inspected, bolts re-oiled. The rifles that had waited through 2 decades of peace were suddenly pressed back into service. They went first to training schools and coastal defense units, then to a new civilian army forming almost overnight, the Home Guard. It was a weapon from a different century, yet in those anxious months it was better than no weapon at all. And as Britain braced for invasion, the forgotten rifle of the Great War was about to earn a second reputation, not as an obsolete relic, but as a stopgap that quietly kept a nation armed. The summer of 1940 was an age of improvisation. Britain had lost nearly all of its heavy equipment in France. Entire divisions returned home with little more than sidearms. While new rifles were still months away from full production, the pattern 1914 became a bridge between defeat and recovery. It was a stopgap that didn't appear on posters or speeches, but without it, the defenses of Britain would have been paper-thin. The War Office moved quickly. Rifles stored since the Great War were inspected, cleaned, and reissued from central depots. Ordnance factories at Enfield, Fazakerley, and BSA began reconditioning operations. Faded Great War markings, RE, ERA, Win, were still visible on the steel, silent reminders that these weapons had once crossed the Atlantic to save Britain before. Now they were doing it again. The rifles went wherever the need was greatest. Newly raised Home Guard units drilled with pattern 1914s in churchyards and factories, learning to handle a weapon that many veterans called the old American Enfield. Its weight was considerable, its bolts slower than the Lee Enfield's famous rapid action, yet its accuracy inspired confidence. On Britain's beaches and cliffs, platoons sighted them on makeshift ranges, preparing to meet a German landing that never came. A smaller number found their way into the hands of regular troops stationed far from the front. Airfield defense crews, depot guards, and naval shore parties used them for local protection. In the early days of the Blitz, when raids gutted armories and supply chains strained under constant bombardment, the pattern 1914 ensured that no post went unarmed. Then came a new purpose: precision. Ordnance officers recognized that the rifle's Mauser-style action and heavier barrel gave it an accuracy advantage. Selected rifles, especially those with clean bores and tight groups, were set aside for conversion into sniper weapons. Optical mounts were fitted, scopes installed, and triggers polished. What began as an obsolete reserve weapon was about to become one of the most accurate rifles of the war. The pattern 1914 had re-entered service by necessity, but it would remain by merit. It was proof that engineering from an earlier age could still meet the demands of a new kind of war, one fought from hedgerows, rooftops, and rubble. And as the war expanded beyond Britain's shores, the rifle's quiet evolution continued, shaping its new identity among the most disciplined marksmen of the British Army. Precision shooting in wartime is often born from adaptation rather than design. By 1941, as Britain rebuilt its armies, the Pattern 1914 emerged not just as a reserve rifle but as a specialist weapon. Its strength, weight, and inherently rigid receiver made it ideal for conversion into a sniper platform. What had once been considered a cumbersome infantry rifle was suddenly recognized for the very qualities the trenches of 1914 had punished it for: steadiness, accuracy, and stability. The transformation began in the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield. Carefully selected rifles were stripped down, their barrels gauged for wear, and actions inspected for alignment. Only those showing the tightest tolerances were chosen for conversion. Onto these receivers, engineers fitted scope mounts and optics, early on modified Aldous and Winchester A5 sights, and later, British No. 32 scopes similar to those used on the No. 4T. A new cheek rest and fine trigger adjustments completed the conversion. The result was officially designated the Pattern 1914 MKI-T, but among marksmen it earned a simpler name, the Sniper's P14. In skilled hands, the rifle proved devastatingly accurate. Reports from the Western Desert tell of British and Commonwealth snipers using Pattern 1914 TS to pick off enemy observers at 600 yards or more, distances where standard infantry rifles could only harass. The long sight radius, smooth bolt, and crisp two-stage trigger gave the shooter confidence shot after shot. Its 5-round magazine was small by modern standards, but for deliberate, precise fire it was sufficient. As the war expanded into North Africa, Italy, and Northwest Europe, the Pattern 1914 T served alongside the newer No. 4 T Enfield. Some preferred the lighter handling of the No. 4, but others swore by the P14's solid balance and minimal recoil. Its Mauser-style locking lugs absorbed pressure evenly, maintaining accuracy even after years of service. Snipers trained at the British Army Small Arms School at Bisley often used the P14 for instruction, valuing its predictable grouping and ease of maintenance. Beyond its technical success, the rifle carried a symbolism of continuity. The same manufacturing precision that had equipped Britain during the Great War now provided the foundation for a modern precision weapon. It was a reminder that the lessons of one conflict could arm the survivors of another. While the Pattern 1914 sniping career was limited in numbers, its impact on doctrine was far-reaching. The methods perfected with the P14 laid the groundwork for post-war sniper training, influencing everything from rifle bedding to scope alignment procedures. And yet, for every marksman carrying a scoped P14 into battle, thousands of others stood guard at home, holding the same rifle in its original, unmodified form, protecting factories, airfields, and coastal towns. While the Pattern 1914 T hunted across deserts and hedgerows, its unscoped counterparts performed a quieter duty at home. Between 1940 and 1943, Britain's cities, ports, and railways were guarded by volunteers, factorymen, retired soldiers, and teenagers too young for the regular army. To them, the Pattern 1914 was both relic and reassurance. It was a weapon from their father's war, heavy in the hands but steady in the shoulder, a physical link to the generation that had endured the Somme and Ypres. The Home Guard relied heavily on these rifles in its early months. While propaganda films showed new recruits proudly shouldering the Lee Enfield, most units drilled with the older Pattern 1914s stamped Eddystone, Winchester, or Remington. The markings caused confusion, American names on British weapons, but each was a reminder of the shared industrial effort that had once saved Britain. Veterans recognized the rifle's accuracy and its ability to endure neglect. In the damp climate of rural England, where oil was scarce and storage poor, the P14's sturdy construction proved an asset. Coastal defense companies used it to watch over estuaries and harbors. Anti-aircraft batteries kept them for close defense, guarding against paratroopers and saboteurs. At airfields, ground crews trained with P14s during off-duty hours, turning maintenance sheds into makeshift ranges. Even the local defense volunteers, the earliest form of the Home Guard, received them in mismatched batches, their stocks dark with age and cosmoline. For many, the first rifle they ever held was one older than they were. The rifle's presence extended beyond the British Isles. Garrison units in Iceland, Malta, and the Caribbean received shipments of P-14s for local security. Canada issued them to training camps and coastal patrols, while New Zealand and South Africa maintained small reserves. In the hands of Commonwealth troops, the Pattern 1914 continued to fulfill its original purpose: a dependable, accurate rifle that required little fuss. By late 1943, production of the No. 4 Enfield and the Sten submachine gun had finally caught up with demand. Home Guard units began exchanging their P-14s for more modern arms. Yet even as the rifles were turned in, many volunteers expressed reluctant respect for the old weapon. It had been their companion through the darkest years, when Britain stood alone and anything that fired was worth its weight in steel. The Pattern 1914 had defended the island in silence. But across the Atlantic, its twin had already taken on a different life, one that would shape the outcome of the war in its own way. The Pattern 1914 story cannot be told without its mirror image, the rifle that became the backbone of American infantry in 2 world wars. When Britain first contracted U.S. manufacturers during the Great War, those same factories, Winchester, Remington, and the massive Eddystone plant, tooled up with an efficiency unmatched in Europe. When America entered the conflict in 1917, the design was quickly adapted to fire the U.S. 30-06 cartridge. Thus, the M1917 Enfield was born, the Pattern 1914's American cousin. The M1917 kept the P-14's robust Mauser-style action and rear-mounted aperture sight, but replaced the .303 chamber with the longer .30-06. It became the most widely issued rifle to American forces in World War I, arming roughly 2/3 of U.S. troops who went to France. After the armistice, millions of M1917s were stored in U.S. arsenals. Decades later, they would return to service in new ways, and some would find their way back to Britain. During the early years of the Second World War, before the Lend-Lease Act of 1941 formally linked the Allied economies, America quietly began shipping small arms across the Atlantic. Among these were large numbers of M1917 rifles, supplied to Britain as emergency reserves and training weapons. For many Home Guard units, these U.S. Enfields filled the same role as the Pattern 1914: strong, reliable, and plentiful. Soldiers could even interchange bayonets and parts in some cases, a testament to the common ancestry of the 2 rifles. The design's strength impressed American ordnance officers as well. When the United States entered the war, the M1917 again equipped garrison and training units, freeing the semi-automatic M1 Garand for frontline troops. In the Pacific, it guarded airfields and depots. In Alaska, it endured freezing temperatures that froze lubricants solid in lesser rifles. A few were converted into sniper rifles with Weaver or Lyman optics, echoing the British practice with the P-14T. The shared lineage of the 2 rifles represented more than engineering continuity. It symbolized industrial cooperation. What began as Britain's search for a modern rifle had evolved into a transatlantic partnership in arms manufacturing. The lines between British and American blurred in steel and walnut. Each rifle carried proof marks of a shared history: imperial need, industrial power, and wartime unity. By 1944, as new weapons and tactics transformed the battlefield, both the P-14 and M1917 were nearing the end of their service lives. But neither would vanish quietly. Their influence lingered in the weapons that replaced them, and in the lessons they had taught 2 nations about reliability, craftsmanship, and adaptation under pressure. Those lessons, forged in the trenches of one war and tested in the skies of another, would define the legacy of Britain's Pattern 1914. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Britain stood amid both triumph and exhaustion. Modern warfare had moved on to semi-automatic rifles and automatic weapons, yet the Pattern 1914 lingered for a time in the margins, too solid to discard, too dated to modernize. It had served through 2 world wars in 2 calibers under 2 flags, and its quiet efficiency had outlasted the ideologies it had been built to confront. After the war, the Pattern 1914 was gradually withdrawn from active use. Thousands were placed in long-term storage or sold to Commonwealth allies still rebuilding their forces. Some found second lives in Canada, New Zealand, and India, where they equipped police, cadets, and colonial garrisons. Others were shipped to Greece and Norway under post-war aid programs, guarding borders during the early tensions of the Cold War. In each new posting, the rifle's reliability remained its defining virtue. It could be repaired in the field, fed with standard ammunition, and trusted by men who had little else. Its influence extended beyond its service life. The lessons learned from its design, the rigid action, robust safety, and aperture sights, shaped later British experiments in marksmanship rifles. The pattern 1914 had proven that precision did not require fragility, and that mass production could still yield accuracy if the underlying geometry was sound. Even the later L-42A1 sniper rifles carried echoes of the P-14's philosophy: deliberate, patient engineering over mechanical novelty. Yet, the pattern 1914 never became a symbol in the public imagination. There were no grand memorials, no famous battles where it stood as the star. It existed in the background, in the hands of sentries, trainees, and reserve marksmen who rarely made the newsreels. Its legacy was quiet endurance. It filled the gaps when supply faltered, protected the homeland when invasion seemed imminent, and reminded its users that reliability was a weapon in itself. Today, surviving examples rest in museums and private collections, often mistaken for their American M1917 counterparts. But those who look closely at the British proof marks can trace a remarkable lineage, from pre-war experiments in .276 caliber to the sands of North Africa and the rooftops of London during the Blitz. The pattern 1914 story is not one of glory, but of continuity. A rifle that bridged two eras of warfare and reflected a nation's capacity to adapt under pressure. In the end, it was never meant to be famous. It was meant to work, and it did across continents and decades. In a century defined by rapid change, the pattern 1914 proved that strength and precision could coexist, even in the simplest of tools. Long after newer rifles took its place, it remained a quiet witness to Britain's resolve. A reminder that in war, survival often depends not on the newest weapon, but on the one that never fails. If you have enjoyed this deep dive into forgotten chapters of World War II, don't forget to hit subscribe and let me know in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? I always love seeing the global community gather around these stories.